Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The year 1907 arrived in Asheville, North Carolina, with the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest mountain folk question their resolve. Eleanor Whitlock stood at the frost-covered window of her family's estate on Montford Avenue, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. At 23 years old, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads in church and made matrons whisper behind their fans, dark auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, green eyes that held both intelligence and a dangerous spark of independence, and a figure that even the modest fashions of the era could not entirely conceal. The Whitlock family had made their fortune in tobacco and textiles, their name carrying weight not just in Asheville but throughout the western Carolina mountains. Eleanor's father, Harrison Whitlock, had built an empire through shrewd business dealings and connections that stretched all the way to Charlotte and Raleigh. Her mother, Catherine, descended from one of Virginia's oldest families, brought breeding and social refinement to the Union. Eleanor had been raised with every advantage: education at the finest finishing school in Charleston, summers spent in Saratoga Springs, and the expectation that she would make a match that would elevate the family's standing even further. The engagement had been announced in November, just before Thanksgiving. Thomas Pemberton, heir to the Pemberton shipping fortune, had courted Eleanor with appropriate decorum throughout the previous spring and summer. He was everything a sensible woman could want: handsome in a conventional way with his blonde hair and blue eyes, educated at Yale, mannered, wealthy, and possessed of the kind of steady temperament that promised a comfortable, predictable life. The wedding was set for May, when the dogwoods would be in bloom and the mountain air would be sweet with the scent of new growth. Eleanor had accepted his proposal in her father's study, surrounded by mahogany and leather and the smell of expensive cigars. She had said yes because it made sense, because her parents beamed with approval, because Thomas represented security and social position. She had said yes even though her heart remained curiously unmoved by his carefully rehearsed declarations of affection. The winter months passed in a blur of preparations. Catherine threw herself into planning with the fervor of a military campaign. Guest lists were drafted and revised. Fabric samples arrived from New York and Philadelphia. The Pemberton family traveled down from Richmond for an engagement party that drew 200 of Asheville's most prominent citizens to the Whitlock estate. Eleanor smiled through it all, played the part of the delighted bride-to-be, accepted congratulations and advice from married women who assured her that affection would grow with time and proximity. But at night, alone in her bedroom with its silk wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains, she felt a growing hollowness in her chest, a sense that she was walking towards something permanent and irrevocable without ever having truly lived. It was in early February when everything changed. Harrison Whitlock had hired a new foreman for the textile mill he owned on the French Broad River. The previous manager had died suddenly of a heart attack, and production had fallen behind schedule. The new man came with excellent recommendations from mills in South Carolina: efficient, honest, a worker who had risen through the ranks through sheer competence rather than family connections. His name was Daniel Reeves, and when Eleanor first saw him at a dinner her father hosted for key employees and local businessmen, she felt something shift inside her chest, as if her heart had suddenly remembered how to beat properly. Daniel was 30 years old, tall and lean with the kind of strength that came from actual labor rather than gymnasium exercise. His hair was dark, almost black, and he wore it a bit longer than was fashionable. His hands, Eleanor noticed when they were introduced, bore the calluses and scars of a man who had worked machinery and understood the industrial world from the ground up. But it was his eyes that captured her, gray as storm clouds, intelligent and direct, meeting her gaze without either the presumption of familiarity or the obsequiousness she had come to expect from men of lesser social standing. He spoke little during dinner, but when he did, his words carried weight. He discussed labor conditions and production efficiency with her father, but also quoted Whitman and mentioned that he spent his free time reading at the public library. Here was a man who had educated himself, who had ambition but also depth, who seemed to belong to a different category entirely from the young men of her social circle. Eleanor told herself it meant nothing. She was engaged. She was weeks away from ordering her trousseau. She was promised to Thomas Pemberton, And whatever momentary flutter she had felt seeing Daniel Reeves was merely the nervousness of a bride-to-be, the last gasps of girlish fantasy before settling into the reality of married life. But she could not stop thinking about him. When she rode past the mill with her mother to check on the progress of fabric being woven for the wedding, she found herself hoping for a glimpse of him. When her father mentioned the mill at dinner, she listened with an attention she had never previously shown for business matters. March arrived with unseasonable warmth. The early spring brought the dogwoods into bloom weeks ahead of schedule, their white and pink blossoms covering the mountains like a promise. Eleanor's wedding dress hung in her room, a confection of silk and lace that had cost more than most families in Asheville earned in a year. The invitations had been sent. The cathedral had been reserved. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And Eleanor felt as if she were drowning. She began finding excuses to visit the mill. She told her mother she wanted to understand the business that helped sustain their family. She told her father she was taking an interest in the commercial side of things, thinking ahead to when she would be mistress of her own household and need to understand finances. Harrison, pleased by this display of practical thinking, encouraged her visits. Catherine worried it was unladylike but allowed it, thinking it a passing fancy that would end once Eleanor was married and had a household to manage. Daniel treated her with perfect propriety. He showed her the looms, explained the manufacturing process, discussed the economics of textile production with the same seriousness he would afford a man. But there were moments, hands touching when he handed her a bolt of fabric to feel, eyes meeting across the noise of the machinery, a conversation about a book they had both read that stretched longer than necessary. Neither spoke of anything improper. Neither acknowledged the current running between them. But it was there, undeniable and dangerous, growing stronger with each encounter. It was on a warm afternoon in late March when everything crystallized. Eleanor had come to the mill ostensibly to approve the final selection of fabric for the cathedral decorations. Daniel was alone in the office, working on production schedules. Rain had begun falling, a sudden spring storm that turned the sky dark and sent water sheeting down the windows. They stood looking at fabric samples, and somehow the conversation turned personal. Daniel spoke of his childhood in the mountains, his father who had died in a mining accident, his determination to rise above the poverty he had been born into through education and hard work. Eleanor found herself speaking of her own loneliness, the feeling of being trapped in a life that had been decided for her before she was old enough to have a voice in the matter. The moment stretched between them, charged and impossible. Then Daniel stepped back, putting distance between them. He spoke carefully, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. He told her she deserved happiness. He told her she should marry Thomas Pemberton and have the life she had been raised for. He told her that what he felt, and here he stopped, then continued, what he felt for her was inappropriate given their different stations, given her engagement, given every rule that governed their world. But he said it anyway. He loved her. He had loved her since that first dinner. And he would leave Asheville if his presence made her life more difficult. Eleanor stood frozen, the rain drumming against the windows, the smell of cotton and machine oil in the air, and felt her carefully constructed world crack apart. She realized with startling clarity that she loved him too. That she had been half alive until she met him. That Thomas Pemberton represented safety and convention while Daniel Reeves represented something she had never thought she could have. Genuine connection, intellectual companionship, passion, choice. What she said next would change everything. She told him not to leave. She told him she felt the same. She told him she did not know what to do, but she could not marry Thomas while feeling this way. And then, with the rain falling and her heart pounding, she kissed him. It was brief, desperate, and absolutely ruinous. Because neither of them noticed that James Patterson, one of the mill workers, had come to deliver a message and had seen everything through the office window. By the next morning, word had spread through the mill. By that afternoon, rumors had reached Asheville's drawing rooms. By evening, Harrison Whitlock knew that his daughter had been seen in a compromising position with his foreman. The scandal had begun. Harrison Whitlock confronted his daughter in his study, the same room where she had accepted Thomas Pemberton's proposal 4 months earlier. His rage was cold and controlled, which made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. He told her the damage she had done. He told her that her reputation was now in question. He told her that Thomas's family would hear the rumors and might call off the engagement. He told her that she had disgraced herself and the family name over a mill worker, a man with no family, no position, no prospects beyond what Harrison himself had given him out of charity. Eleanor tried to explain. She tried to make her father understand that she could not marry Thomas while loving someone else. She tried to speak of authenticity and genuine feeling. Harrison cut her off. Love, he told her, was a luxury for people who could afford it. For families like theirs, marriage was about alliance, about strengthening position, about securing the future. Romantic love was a fantasy peddled in novels, not something on which to base life decisions. He had loved her mother, he said, but that love had grown from respect and partnership, not from some dramatic passion that led to scandalous behavior in a textile mill. Catherine took a different approach. She came to Eleanor's room after the confrontation with Harrison, sat beside her daughter on the bed, and spoke with the weary wisdom of someone who understood the world's cruelty. She told Eleanor that while she sympathized with her feelings, the reality was harsh. If Eleanor broke her engagement to marry Daniel Reeves, she would be cut off from the family. She would be ostracized from society. She would live in poverty, because Daniel's salary was modest at best. She would lose everything: her home, her security, her family, her place in the world. And for what? For a man she had known for 6 weeks? For a passion that might not survive the grinding reality of financial struggle and social isolation? Catherine urged her to think practically. She urged her to end whatever had started with Daniel, to marry Thomas as planned, to build a good life based on mutual respect and shared values. Catherine assured her that this intensity she felt would fade, that she would look back in 10 years and be grateful she had chosen sensibly. Eleanor spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. She loved Daniel. She had never felt more alive than in those conversations with him, had never experienced the kind of intellectual and emotional connection they shared. But she also understood the reality her mother had outlined. She had been raised in comfort and privilege. She had never scrubbed a floor or cooked a meal. She had never worried about money or gone hungry or worn the same dress multiple times because she owned nothing else. Could she really give up everything for love? Was she strong enough to survive the life she would be choosing? She went to see Daniel at his small rented room on the edge of town. It was the first time she had gone anywhere alone without a chaperone, another scandal to add to the growing list. She told him everything: the confrontation with her father, her mother's warnings, the impossible choice before her. She asked him what they should do. Daniel's response was everything she both wanted and feared. He told her he loved her more than he had thought possible to love another person. He told her he would spend the rest of his life making her happy if she chose him. But he also told her the truth. He had nothing to offer her but himself. His savings amounted to less than what she probably spent on gloves in a year. He could support them, but barely. They would live in a small house or rooms. She would do her own cooking and cleaning. They would be shut out from her family and the society she had always known. And he had no right to ask her to make that sacrifice. But then he said something that decided everything. He told her that he would rather have 1 year of genuine happiness with her than a lifetime of comfort with someone he did not love. He told her that material things could be acquired, but authentic connection was rare and precious. He told her he believed they could build a life together based on partnership and mutual respect, that he would work harder than he ever had to give her the best life possible within his means. And most importantly, he told her the choice was hers. He would accept whatever she decided without resentment. Eleanor made her decision. She would break her engagement to Thomas Pemberton. She would marry Daniel Reeves. She would accept the consequences, whatever they might be. The scene when she told Thomas was awful. They met in the parlor of the Whitlock estate, with her parents present as witnesses. Thomas arrived expecting perhaps some minor wedding detail to discuss, and instead heard Eleanor tell him that she could not marry him. At first he did not understand. Then, as the meaning penetrated, his face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, anger, humiliation. He demanded to know why. Eleanor, trying to maintain some dignity, simply said that she had realized they were not suited. Thomas was not a fool. The rumors had reached him. He knew about Daniel Reeves. He asked directly if she was breaking their engagement for a mill foreman. The silence that followed answered his question. Thomas stood, his face white with rage and shame. He told her she was making a fool of herself. He told her she would regret this decision for the rest of her life. He told her that no respectable family would receive her once word spread that she had jilted her fiancé for a common laborer. Then he turned to Harrison and Catherine and told them he was sorry they had to witness their daughter's disgrace. He left without another word, and Eleanor never saw him again. The social repercussions were swift and brutal. The Pemberton family, humiliated by the broken engagement, made sure every family of standing in Richmond and throughout Virginia knew what had happened. In Asheville, the story spread like wildfire. Eleanor Whitlock, who had everything, had thrown it all away for an inappropriate infatuation. Some pitied her as a foolish girl who had lost her senses. Others condemned her as morally deficient. A few romantic souls thought it tragically beautiful, but they were in the minority. Harrison made good on his threat. He informed Eleanor that if she married Daniel Reeves, she would be cut off completely. No dowry, no inheritance, no financial support of any kind. She would not be welcome in the family home. Her name would be removed from family documents. As far as the Whitlocks were concerned, she would cease to exist. Catherine begged her to reconsider, wept and pleaded, but when Eleanor remained firm in her decision, her mother's grief turned to cold withdrawal. Daniel, learning what Eleanor would be sacrificing, offered one last time to walk away. He told her it was not too late. She could apologize to Thomas, could blame temporary insanity or illness, could still salvage something of her old life. Eleanor refused. She had made her choice. She would rather face an uncertain future with him than a certain future without him. They were married in April, not in the cathedral with 500 guests and an orchestra as originally planned, but in a small chapel on the outskirts of Asheville. The minister who performed the ceremony did so reluctantly, aware of the scandal but moved by their obvious devotion. Fewer than 10 people attended. Harrison had ensured Daniel lost his position at the mill. No business in Asheville would employ him after this scandal. They left immediately after the ceremony for a small town 3 hours north, where Daniel had secured a position managing a smaller, struggling textile operation for a fraction of his previous salary. Their wedding night was spent in a modest boarding house. Eleanor, who had never dressed herself without help from a maid, struggled with the buttons of her simple cotton dress. Daniel, who had never been with a woman of her class, was gentle and patient. They came together with tenderness and hope, believing that love would be enough to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The first months were difficult but manageable. The town of Marion was smaller than Asheville, more insular, and word of their scandalous marriage had not yet fully penetrated. Daniel worked 12-hour days at the mill, trying to improve its operations and prove his worth to the owner, who had taken a chance on him despite the vague rumors. Eleanor struggled to adapt to her new life. The small house they rented had 4 rooms and was a tenth the size of her bedroom at the Whitlock estate. She learned to cook, though her early attempts were nearly inedible. She learned to clean, to mend clothes, to manage a household budget that required tracking every penny. Her hands, which had only ever held books and embroidery needles, became chapped and rough from washing clothes and scrubbing floors. But there were moments of genuine happiness. Evenings when Daniel came home and they would sit together reading by lamplight. Sundays when they would walk in the woods and talk about everything and nothing. Nights when they would lie together in their small bed and she would feel grateful that she had chosen authenticity over comfort. She loved him. That had not changed. When he held her, when they talked about their dreams of saving enough money to perhaps start their own small business, when he looked at her with such tenderness and gratitude, she felt that she had made the right choice. The problem started in late summer. The mill Daniel managed was in worse financial shape than the owner had revealed. Orders were scarce. The equipment was outdated and constantly breaking down. Workers, resentful of a manager who had come under mysterious circumstances and whose wife clearly did not belong in their world, were hostile and uncooperative. Daniel worked desperately to turn things around, but by October it was clear the mill would close. He was let go with 2 weeks' wages and a letter of reference that damned with faint praise. They moved to a smaller town, then another. Each time, Daniel found work at a mill or factory, and each time, the rumors followed them. The story had taken on a life of its own in the retelling. Eleanor had been Thomas Pemberton's wife, not merely his fiancée, in some versions. She had left him on their wedding day. She had run off with multiple men. She was mentally unstable. She was a fallen woman. The whispers followed them from town to town, making it impossible for Daniel to keep steady employment or for Eleanor to make friends among the other wives. By winter, they had moved 4 times. Their savings were gone. They were living in 2 rooms above a dry goods store, and Daniel was working at a furniture factory for wages barely sufficient to cover rent and food. Eleanor, who had been raised in luxury, found herself wearing the same 2 dresses over and over, mending them until the fabric was more patched than original cloth. She learned what real hunger felt like, what it meant to go to bed cold because they could not afford enough coal for heat. She learned that pride could be swallowed when the choice was between accepting charity and starving. The pregnancy was discovered in January of 1908. Eleanor felt simultaneously elated and terrified. A child represented hope, a future, the creation of family. But a child also represented another mouth to feed, medical expenses they could not afford, and the reality that Eleanor could no longer help supplement their income by taking in sewing or laundry work once she grew large with child. Daniel tried to hide his worry, but she saw it in his face, the way the lines around his eyes deepened, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. He worked longer hours, took on additional shifts, did whatever necessary to save money for the baby. Eleanor watched him leave before dawn and return after dark, watched the exhaustion etch itself deeper into his features, watched the man she loved wear himself down to nothing in an effort to provide for their small family. And she began to understand something Catherine had tried to tell her, that love, however genuine, could be ground down by the relentless machinery of economic reality. In March, 2 men arrived at their rented rooms. They were employed by Harrison Whitlock and carried a message. Harrison was prepared to forgive Eleanor if she would agree to certain conditions. She must leave Daniel. She must claim the marriage had been a mistake made under duress. She must return to Asheville and live quietly under her parents' roof. In exchange, the Whitlock family would support her and the child she was carrying. They would claim the child was from the broken engagement with Thomas, conceived before the wedding was canceled. It was a lie, but it would salvage Eleanor's reputation and ensure her child grew up in comfort rather than poverty. Daniel would be compensated handsomely and provided with employment in another state, far from North Carolina. Everyone could move forward. Eleanor refused without hesitation. The men left, and she thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. Daniel came home 3 days later with news that he had been dismissed from the furniture factory. No explanation given, just a curt notification that his services were no longer needed. He found new work within a week at a lumber mill, but that position lasted only 5 days before he was let go. Then it happened again. And again. Everywhere Daniel sought employment, the position would evaporate within days. It was not difficult to guess why. Harrison Whitlock's reach was long, and he had connections throughout the state. He was systematically destroying Daniel's ability to provide for his family. By April, they were destitute. The landlord evicted them when they could not pay rent. They moved into a single room in a boarding house in the poorest section of town, a place that smelled of mildew and desperation. Eleanor was 5 months pregnant, exhausted, malnourished. Daniel looked like a man haunted, dark circles under his eyes, his proud bearing replaced by a defeated slouch. They barely spoke anymore. There was nothing left to say. Love had not been enough. The world had proven too harsh, too unforgiving. On a cold night in late April, Daniel did not come home. Eleanor waited, worry gnawing at her, until after midnight. She finally fell into restless sleep and woke to find him there in the morning, sitting at their single rickety table, staring at nothing. When she asked where he had been, he told her he had walked. Just walked through the night, trying to think of solutions, trying to find a way forward. Then he looked at her with eyes full of anguish and said something that broke what remained of her heart. He told her she should take her father's offer. He told her she and the child deserved better than the life he could provide. He told her he loved her enough to let her go. Eleanor refused. She told him they would find a way. She told him they were together and that was what mattered. But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. She could feel their life together slipping away, could feel the weight of reality crushing the fragile thing they had built. The solution, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. A minister from a small church in the mountains sent word that he needed someone to manage the church's charitable operations, a sanctuary they had established to help impoverished families. The position paid very little but included housing in a cottage on the church grounds. It was not mill work, but Daniel was desperate. They accepted. They moved in May to the tiny community of Willow Creek, deep in the mountains. The church was small, white-clapboard with a modest steeple, sitting on 5 acres of land. The sanctuary, a separate building used to distribute food and clothing to families in need, stood behind the church. The cottage they were given was tiny but clean, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a small garden plot. It felt like salvation. Daniel threw himself into the work with the same dedication he had brought to the mills. He organized the sanctuary's operations, built relationships with the mountain families they served, worked to improve the efficiency of their charitable distribution. The minister, Reverend Thomas Grayson, was a kind man who asked no questions about their past and treated them with respect. Eleanor, as her pregnancy advanced, helped as she was able, sewing clothes for children, organizing donations, finding in the work a sense of purpose she had lost during the months of struggle. For a few weeks, they were almost happy. The simplicity of their life in Willow Creek, the beauty of the mountains, the sense that they were doing something meaningful, it felt like perhaps they could build something real here. Eleanor's belly swelled with their child. Daniel smiled again. They talked about the future, about raising their son or daughter in these mountains, about maybe eventually having a little more, not luxury but sufficiency. They should have known it would not last. Harrison Whitlock had not forgotten. He had not forgiven. And he was coming for them. Word reached Willow Creek in early June. Harrison Whitlock was making inquiries about the church and its sanctuary. He had learned where Eleanor and Daniel had gone. More concerning, he had discovered that Reverend Grayson's church had been operating partially on funds from a foundation that had Whitlock family connections. Harrison was calling in old favors, applying pressure, making it known that he expected his daughter to return home and that anyone who aided her in her folly would find their operations suddenly facing financial difficulties. Reverend Grayson, to his credit, did not immediately ask them to leave. He called Daniel and Eleanor to his study and explained the situation. Harrison was a powerful man. If he chose to destroy the church's ability to serve the community, he could do so. Already, 2 major donors had withdrawn their support after receiving visits from Whitlock representatives. But Grayson also said he believed in sanctuary, in protecting those who sought refuge, and he would not force them out unless they chose to go. Daniel and Eleanor faced an impossible decision. They could stay and watch the church and its mission be destroyed because of them. Or they could leave and face an uncertain future with a baby due in less than 2 months. Eleanor was exhausted, worn down by months of struggle, her body heavy with pregnancy, her spirit nearly broken. That night, she wept in Daniel's arms and asked him if she had been foolish to choose love over security, if her pride and romantic notions had ruined both their lives. Daniel held her and told her he would never regret a single moment they had shared, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that whatever came next, they would face it together. But Eleanor heard the weariness in his voice, felt the tremor in his hands, and knew he was as close to breaking as she was. The decision was made for them in the worst way possible. On a hot afternoon in late June, while Daniel was in town buying supplies and Eleanor was resting in the cottage, 3 men arrived at the church. They were not local. They had the look of hired muscle, men who did ugly work for good money. They demanded to speak with Eleanor. Reverend Grayson, sensing danger, positioned himself between them and the cottage where Eleanor was. What exactly happened next would be disputed in the days that followed. The men claimed they had simply been delivering a message from Harrison Whitlock. Grayson claimed they had tried to force their way into the cottage to physically remove Eleanor. What was not disputed was that the confrontation became physical, that one of the men struck Reverend Grayson, that he fell and hit his head on the stone steps of the church, that he lay there bleeding while the men fled, and that Eleanor, hearing the commotion, came out to find the minister unconscious. Grayson survived but was badly injured. The community was outraged. Even in these remote mountains, people had limits to what they would tolerate. A man of God had been assaulted on church property by men everyone suspected had been sent by the powerful tobacco baron trying to force his daughter to return to him. Sympathy, which had been cautious, now swung entirely to Eleanor and Daniel. The mountain people, already suspicious of wealthy lowlanders and their arrogant ways, rallied around the young couple. Harrison Whitlock received word of what had happened. Rather than backing down, he doubled down. He sent word that the church would be held responsible for harboring his daughter against his will, that he would pursue legal action, that every member of the congregation would suffer consequences. It was a threat made in rage, but it had power behind it. Harrison had the money and connections to make their lives miserable. The congregation met and voted. They would not abandon Eleanor and Daniel. Whatever Harrison Whitlock threatened, they would stand firm. It was partially principle and partially pride. Mountain people did not take well to being bullied by coastal elites. If Whitlock wanted a fight, they would give him one. That Daniel, tortured by guilt that his marriage to Eleanor had brought such trouble to people who had shown them nothing but kindness, made a decision. He would go to Asheville. He would confront Harrison Whitlock directly. He would make the old man understand that Eleanor had made her choice, that she was his wife, that she carried his child, and that no amount of money or pressure would change that reality. He would appeal to whatever remained of Harrison's love for his daughter and ask him to end this vendetta and let them live in peace. Eleanor begged him not to go. She had a terrible premonition, a feeling that if he left he would not return. But Daniel was determined. He left on a Thursday morning in mid-July, promising to be back within 3 days. He kissed Eleanor goodbye, placed his hand on her swollen belly, and told her everything would be all right. That he never came back. On Friday, word arrived that Daniel had been found dead near the rail yards in Asheville. The official story was that he had been attempting to hop a freight train and had fallen, striking his head. But there were inconsistencies. Witnesses who had seen him earlier that day said he had been heading toward the Whitlock estate, not the rail yards. The injuries did not match those of a fall from a train. And Daniel was not the kind of man to hop freights. He would have purchased a ticket. Eleanor, 8 months pregnant, received the news in the cottage. She collapsed. Her mind refused to process it. Daniel was dead. Her husband was dead. The man she had given up everything for, who had worked himself nearly to death trying to provide for her, who had loved her with a devotion she had never thought to find, was gone. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her father was responsible. The funeral was held at the church in Willow Creek on a scorching Sunday in July. The small building was packed with mountain families who had come to pay respects to a man they had known only briefly but had come to respect. Eleanor sat in the front row, her face blank with shock, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. She did not cry. She had no tears left. After the service, she asked to be alone in the church. The congregation slowly dispersed, leaving her sitting in the empty building. And there, in that small church in the mountains, something inside Eleanor Whitlock broke completely. She had sacrificed everything for love. She had given up wealth, family, social position, security, all of it, because she believed that genuine connection mattered more than material comfort. And the world had punished her for that choice at every turn. It had ground them down, had made Daniel work himself to exhaustion, had chased them from town to town, and finally, it had taken him from her entirely. Her father, the man who was supposed to love her, had orchestrated it all. He had destroyed her husband rather than allow her to be happy outside the life he had planned for her. The rage that filled Eleanor was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was cold and absolute, a fury that burned away everything else: fear, grief, doubt. Harrison Whitlock had taken everything from her, and she would make sure he understood the cost. Late that night, Eleanor went to the sanctuary building. It was filled with donated goods, clothes, food, supplies meant for families struggling in poverty. She moved through it methodically, knocking over lanterns, piling combustible materials, opening windows to ensure good airflow. Then she lit the fire. It spread quickly, far faster than she had anticipated. The old wood of the building was tinder dry from the summer heat. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed. The flames lit up the night sky, visible for miles. People came running from their homes, forming bucket brigades, trying desperately to save the building. But Eleanor had not left the sanctuary. As the smoke filled her lungs and the heat became unbearable, she understood that this was the only way the story could end. She had nothing left. No husband, no family, no future. Her child would be born into a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. She could not face it. She would not face it. They found her body the next morning in the ruins. She had died from smoke inhalation, curled on her side near what had been the sanctuary's main room. The child in her womb had died with her. Eleanor Whitlock, who had been raised in luxury and had chosen love over comfort, had taken her own life and that of her unborn child rather than continue living in a world that had taken everything from her. The news reached Asheville within hours. Harrison Whitlock received word that his daughter was dead. According to those who were present, he showed no emotion. He simply nodded, dismissed the messenger, and returned to his ledgers. But that night, servants heard strange sounds from his study, something between weeping and rage, the sound of a man confronting consequences he had not anticipated. The investigation into Daniel's death was quietly closed. No charges were filed. The official story remained that he had died in an accident. Harrison Whitlock used his influence to ensure no embarrassing questions were asked. Eleanor's death was ruled accidental as well, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The fire was attributed to a lantern knocked over in darkness, a tragic accident, but the mountain people knew the truth. They knew that Eleanor Whitlock had been driven to desperation by her father's relentless persecution. They knew that Daniel Reeves had been murdered. They knew that the Whitlock family's wealth and power had destroyed two young people whose only crime was loving each other. And they did not forget. The church rebuilt the sanctuary using money donated by families throughout the mountain communities, people who had little to give but gave anyway. They did it in memory of Eleanor and Daniel, as a testimony that the powerful could not always win, that ordinary people would stand against cruelty and injustice. They named the new building Whitlock Sanctuary, ensuring that Eleanor's name would be remembered not as a scandal but as a woman who had chosen love and paid the ultimate price. The story spread throughout western North Carolina and beyond. It was told and retold, taking on mythic proportions. Eleanor Whitlock, the bride who loved the wrong man. The woman who chose authenticity over security and paid for it with everything she had. The tragic figure who haunted the mountains, a reminder of how society crushes those who dare to step outside prescribed roles, who challenge the power of wealth and family expectations. Harrison Whitlock lived another 15 years. His business empire continued to grow. His name remained prominent in North Carolina society. But those close to him said something changed after Eleanor's death. He became more withdrawn, harder, colder. He never spoke his daughter's name. When Catherine Whitlock died in 1912, Harrison did not attend her funeral. When he himself died in 1922, his obituary mentioned his business accomplishments but made no reference to his daughter. The Whitlock family fortune eventually dispersed among distant relatives. The mansion on Montford Avenue was sold and converted into apartments. The textile mills were absorbed by larger corporations. The family name, once so prominent, faded from Asheville society. It was as if the Whitlocks had been erased from history, leaving behind only scattered traces and one persistent story, the story of Eleanor Whitlock and Daniel Reeves. The bride who chose love over duty. The woman who burned it all down rather than live without him. The curse that followed those who valued power over people, who crushed genuine emotion in service of social expectation. The sanctuary that burned in silence while a young woman and her unborn child died rather than face a world that had taken everything from them. Even now, more than a century later, people in the mountains tell the story. They point to the rebuilt sanctuary and remember. They speak of Eleanor not with pity but with a kind of fierce respect. She had been given a choice between comfort and authenticity, and she had chosen authenticity. That it destroyed her does not diminish the courage of that choice. That the world punished her for it does not mean she was wrong. The curse of Eleanor Whitlock is not supernatural. It is the very real consequence of a society that values position over people, wealth over love, reputation over genuine connection. It is the weight of expectation that crushes individuality. It is the price paid by those who dare to choose their own path in a world determined to keep them on predetermined roads. It is the fire that burns in silence while everyone pretends not to see the smoke, and it endures, not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that love is not always enough, that courage does not guarantee success, that the powerful can destroy the powerless with impunity, but also that choosing authentically, even when it costs everything, has a value that transcends survival. Eleanor Whitlock lived only 24 years. But in those years, she loved deeply, chose bravely, and refused to accept a life that was not her own. The world broke her. But it could not make her compromise. That is the curse. That is the legacy. That is the story that burns on, long after the sanctuary has been rebuilt, long after the Whitlock name has faded, long after everyone who knew Eleanor is dead and buried. It burns because it is true, because it happens over and over, because every generation has its Eleanor Whitlocks, people who dare to choose love over security, who pay terrible prices for that choice, who remind us that the most profound human act is sometimes simply refusing to live a lie. The sanctuary stands. The mountains remember. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees and the old church sits silent in darkness, people swear they can still smell smoke. Not the smoke of fire, but the smoke of dreams burned away, of love destroyed, of a young woman who had everything and gave it all away for something more precious and more fragile than any fortune. The smoke of a life lived authentically in a world that punishes authenticity. The smoke that never quite dissipates, that hangs in the air as warning and testament, reminder and memorial. Eleanor Whitlock, the bride who loved the wrong man. The woman who burned. The curse that was never supernatural at all, just the brutal reality of a world that destroys those who dare to feel deeply in a society built on shallow convention. Her story ends in ash and silence. But it does not end. It burns on. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.